Hello, and thanks for joining me. Welcome to Ask an Atheist Day. Actually, that's not quite true. There is such a thing as Ask an Atheist Day, and it happens twice a year, in September and April, but I decided not to wait. It seemed a fitting way to recognize the fact that this channel now has over 5,000 subscribers, which kind of blows me away, to be honest. I mean, it's not much compared to the big guns of YouTube atheism like Logic and Vice Rhino and Apologia, but it's better than I ever really expected to do with this little hobby of mine. Anyway, I solicited questions from my subscribers to this channel as well as from other sources, and I want to thank everyone who submitted a question for this atheist. Here we go. Brandon asks, if somehow various religions lost enough of their power and followers, what would you like to see happen to their holy sites? For example, if Catholicism is no longer followed, what would you like to see happen to Vatican City? With Islam, what would you like to see happen with Mecca? I remember a spokesman for the Libertarian Party once suggested that if the IRS building were demolished, pieces of the building would become souvenirs, just as pieces of the Berlin Wall became souvenirs after it was demolished. And by selling those souvenirs, we could pay off the national debt. Of course, this would constitute revenue, which would be internal revenue, which might need some kind of, service to process. But oh well. Brandon might be suggesting that the Vatican, Mecca, and other holy sites should be similarly demolished. I don't want to see that happen. If religion was no longer a thing, I would like to see these places preserved. For one thing, there's a great deal of art bound up in most holy sites. Art which comes from a tradition which humanity will never see again, and which in many cases is just awe-inspiring. This art can't be replaced, nor do I feel it's enough to preserve it digitally. For another thing, there is enormous historical significance in such places. They were very important sites to large segments of humanity for very long periods of time. There may come a day when these holy sites will be like the statues of the Confederate generals you see, or in many cases used to see in the South. A day when there's a consensus that the terrible feelings engendered by these things outweigh both their artistic merit and their historical significance. But I think we're at least several generations from that happening. Dylan asks, how much has the problem of evil and a literal interpretation by young earth creationists of the garden story in the book of Genesis affected your atheist beliefs? I was never a young earth creationist or a biblical inerrantist. I never believed, once I was old enough to think about it rationally, that the whole Garden of Eden story was true. When I was a little kid, I found a book which was essentially the Bible in graphic novel form, and it was a really neat way to communicate the contents of the Bible to my 7 or 8 year old mind. It left a lot out, of course, like the bit where Lot's daughters got their father drunk, had sex with him, and gave birth to his children. God's critical message to humanity isn't kid-friendly, is it? But as I grew older and came to understand on my own that many of these things were just parables, I became surprised that a great many grown-ups spoke of these events as though they were literal historical events. It made me very confused. Why would God teach these events as literal truth when they weren't? And if I was wrong, if they were literal truth, why would the early sequence of events in the world contradict both science and common sense? It wasn't until college that I ran across the various ways in which this confusion could be harnessed into arguments for atheism, and at the same time I ran across the argument from evil. Until that time, I was considering both problems in an apologetic sense, that is, given that God exists, why are these various things happening? As a grown-up, I finally considered them from the other angle. Given that these various things are happening, why should we believe that God exists? So, although I was never a young earth creationist or a biblical inerrantist, I would say that those narratives only served to make the argument from religious confusion more relatable to me. They probably did contribute to my becoming an atheist. Cyborg 2056 asks, do you believe that evil actions should be punished? Yes, whenever possible. When Martin Bormann entered Hitler's quarters on April 30th, 1945, he saw Hitler dead of a gunshot wound, the gun lying at his feet, and Eva Braun, Eva Hitler as of the previous day, lying dead next to him with no visible wounds, probably of cyanide poisoning. Now, it is unlikely in the extreme that while sitting there on the sofa, Hitler did what was necessary to be saved, prayed, accepted Jesus, whatever, and was then shot by Eva Braun, who planted the gun and swallowed cyanide. It's unlikely, but it is possible. Which means Christians must accept the possibility that even under their worldview, evil actions are not always, and by right should not always be, punished. Rather, they have to say that those born-again Christians who commit evil in this life, where that evil is not punished in this life, are redeemed so long as they are saved before they die. The redemption is what is necessary, not the punishment. But of course, we're entitled to ask why a good person who happens to not be a member of their religion should require redemption. Because what, stealing a cookie when you were 6 years old is an infinite transgression requiring infinite torture unless you accept their religion? Deep down, many Christians know that there's something wrong with that. Nombre E asks, what is more convincing for you, Arguments against the existence of a deity, or the failure of arguments in favor of the existence of a deity? In my early years as an atheist, I found arguments against the existence of God to be more compelling than the failure of arguments for God. I first decided that arguments for God failed, but that might only be because we don't know enough about how the universe works, or how morality works, or how history works, to be able to adequately support such arguments. It didn't mean God didn't exist. But when it came to arguments like the argument from evil and the argument from divine hiddenness, I found the logic inescapable. And believe me, I tried to escape it. I think what made such arguments effective in changing my mind, whereas they didn't change others' minds, is that first of all, I read these arguments straight from the source, from the actual books written by atheists, rather than in the books of apologists who quoted excerpts from atheists' books, or paraphrased them, or outright strawmanned them. And second, I placed a greater emphasis on the perfectly loving aspect of God than do a great many Christians. Even if every single argument for the existence of God is successful, cosmological, design, moral, resurrection, miracles, religious experience, not a single one of them proves the existence of a God who is perfectly loving, whereas the argument from evil alone disproves exactly that. As I said, that was my thinking in my early years. These days, I find that the failure of arguments for God is itself a compelling argument against God, given that God is defined as having revealed himself through the natural world. There should be no need for apologetics. Saying that God will reveal himself to you if you only seek him, if you only humble yourself, if you only get down and pray, if you only do this, if you only do that, is among the strongest evidence for atheism. Because we know that putting yourself into this environment, committing to these rituals and behaviors, is likely to induce religious belief whether or not the religion is actually true, as evidenced by the fact that this is exactly how non-Christian religions gain converts. If the Christian God actually existed, we wouldn't expect that the Christian religion would have to perpetuate itself in exactly the way it would if God did not exist, if all this was a result of natural occurrences. J. Rose asks, why in Exodus 9:12 did the Lord harden the Pharaoh's heart to stop him from freeing the slaves, only to use it as an excuse to go on a killing spree of all the firstborn, and cattle for some reason? Our old friend Almondo has actually suggested an answer to this. He stated, in the video in which he announced his readiness for war against atheism, at the same time his mother came in and asked him if he wanted some milk.
Mondo, did he recently,
I'm ready for spiritual war, guys.
Did he recently drink milk? Yeah.
I'm ready for war, guys.
That if we turned away from God, then God would finish the process of hardening our hearts. So the apologetic here is that Pharaoh began the process of hardening his own heart, and God finished it because... reasons? Why would he do that? If free will is such a big thing, why would you prevent humans from ever being able to change their mind? If it's because you know they won't, because you're all-knowing and you know the future, then where's the need for any heart hardening? Why not just let history take its course? This whole thing arises because apologists feel that they need the concept of free will in order to defend against the argument from evil because they feel it's a good defense. It's not, see my video on the free will theodicy, but they believe it is. The authors of the Moses and Pharaoh legend were not quite so concerned. They had no problem with the idea of God doing whatever the hell he wanted with human hearts and human firstborn children. And cattle for some reason. And many apologists today feel the same way, but they feel like they need some answer for when the question comes up. It doesn't need to be a good answer, it just needs to be good enough to help slow the hemorrhaging of Christians away from Christianity down to a trickle, so that it will still be a powerful and relevant force in the world for their few remaining decades of life. Honestly, I think that's what motivates many, if not most, of the older apologists like Craig and Turek. Timothy asks, do you see any value in religion? There's an apologist named David Wood who spent 5 years in prison for attempting to kill his father. He attributes it to being an atheist at the time, but if that were the case, you'd see a great deal more atheists in prison than Christians, relative to the general population, and in fact, it's the other way around. I personally attribute it to his being a sociopath. That's not a slur. Wood has been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Anyway, he converted to Christianity while in prison, and as far as he's concerned, that makes it okay that he tried to kill his father because, as far as the one person whose opinion matters is concerned, he's all good. So what if that person isn't the victim or a member of society? Anyway, there is practical value in Christianity in this case, because it makes it less likely that David Wood will try to kill anyone else. There's a code of conduct there that he feels beholden to, and the overall system containing that code speaks to him on a deep personal level. So there is utility there. Of course, there would be even more utility in a system that doesn't teach that if he ever again does smash someone's head in with a hammer, he just has to again go through the ritual of getting on his knees, humbling himself, praying, etc., and it'll be like it never happened. I personally would feel more more comfortable around him if, instead of believing he's ultimately accountable to someone who only cares if he's a Christian or not, he believed he was ultimately accountable to the people around him. If only the friend he'd made in prison was a secular humanist instead of a Christian. So yes, I do see value in religion, the same value I see in the little Dutch boy who plugged a hole in the dike with his finger, until the grown-ups came along and fixed it for real. Dog named Dio asks, how do you distinguish between the concepts of deity and devil? A deity is a good guy, a devil is a bad guy. That's it. Satanists, and I'm talking about actual theistic Satanists who believe that the Abrahamic entities actually exist, and this seems to be a pretty tiny group, regard Satan as the deity and God as the devil. It's all a matter of perspective. A more interesting question to my mind is how to distinguish between deity, devil, and lesser beings such as angels. Calvin asks, what is the one thing that gets under your skin the most concerning the claims, actions, or beliefs of believers? I'll go first. I really don't like it when certain believers try to tell you incorrectly what you believe and then go off on you when you say that you disagree with their characterization. Yeah, that pretty much nails it as far as I'm concerned. When they say that I'm evil, that I'm a fool, that I do no good works, that doesn't bother me much because deep down they know it's crap. They know it's just poetic nonsense from the reign of King David. They can see for themselves that atheists are intelligent and basically good people, or they can learn that with a little research. But when they claim and when they honestly believe that they can read our minds, whether directly or by proxy, I have some pretty pointed thoughts about that. And the fact that they show no reaction whatsoever to those thoughts is Exhibit A in the case for they're full of crap. Crystalline Entity asks, which God do you disbelieve or lack belief in? YouTube atheists seem to be focused on the Christian God, but other gods are available, Judaism, Hinduism, pantheism, etc. I used to know a person who claimed that God was his toaster oven, and argued from that atheism was absurd because obviously his toaster oven existed. He was dedicated to this song and dance. He never once admitted in all the years I knew him that he did not believe his toaster oven was God. The best way to clarify my own atheism would be, I do not believe in the existence of anything that I consider to be a god. I believe in toaster ovens. I do not believe that toaster ovens are God. Muslims believe in Jesus. They do not believe that he is God. They relegate him to the role of prophet. YouTube atheists, at least in America and Europe, do indeed focus their attention on discrediting the idea that the Christian God exists. I personally go a step further and focus my attention on the general or generic theistic God, an omnipotent, omniscient, all-loving supernatural creator of the universe. This is largely due to my scholarly background. I do sometimes refer to this as the Christian God because that's the culture in which I was raised, that's the path that my brain is accustomed to following, but most of the arguments I make on my channel can be applied really to any monotheistic God. Science Explains actually posed a number of questions to me about the Bible and theology before realizing that this is Ask an Atheist, not Ask a Theologian. I didn't know I gave off theologian vibes. That's actually a little scary. But there is one question he asked that I want to answer. Why does an all-knowing perfect entity create additional minds? It already knows everything they will do and say. It can have infinite conversations with itself. It already has perfect morality and perfect belief in itself. I believe that the standard answer here is that God is infinitely glorious. And if you're infinitely glorious, then it's not enough to realize yourself how glorious you are. Even if you are all-knowing and completely self-assured, you need lesser minds to glorify you. Which, it seems to me, doesn't change the fact that a perfect being would have no needs. This means that there's a conflict between being perfect and being perfectly glorious. Maybe glory isn't all it's cracked up to be. Apropos of which, Red Saber asks, do you have a video where you lay out your reasons why the Christian God can't exist? Not at this time, although I've mentioned a couple arguments in previous videos, such as free will and omniscience. A video about incompatible properties is simmering on the back burner right now. Expect to see it, but don't expect to see it soon. Zolodare asks, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? For a European swallow, between 9 and 11 meters per second, based on an average length of 12 centimeters and an average weight of 20 grams. I'm using metric units here because, Europe. For an African swallow, there's virtually no data available, so I honestly don't know what... Tracker asks, which argument for the existence of God doesn't start by assuming the existence of God in order to find it appealing? Presuppositionalist arguments, if arguments is the right word, begin by assuming God. Most other arguments for the existence of God are not known for that. They start from non-question-begging premises and attempt to establish that God exists. However, when you dig into the various ways that the arguments are defended from objections, you start to see circularity. For example, I had a viewer object to the puddle analogy I briefly employed in my recent video on the fine-tuning argument, on the grounds that without a finely tuned universe, there would be no puddle. So his logic was, the fine-tuning argument is not unsound, therefore a puddle requires fine-tuning, therefore inasmuch as the puddle is analogous to our universe requires fine-tuning, therefore the puddle analogy is self-defeating, therefore the fine-tuning argument is not unsound. And it's not just random guys on YouTube who do this. There's an objection to the Kalam cosmological argument that it requires the A theory of time or presentism to be true, and Einsteinian relativity gives us pretty good evidence that the B theory or eternalism is true. William Lane Craig's response to this is, the Kalam argument is not unsound, therefore God exists, therefore a privileged frame of reference exists, therefore presentism is true, therefore the B-time objection fails, therefore the Kalam argument is not unsound. Seriously. You have to take an ice scraper to the amount of gloss he put over it, but that's his argument. And of course, when an apologist deploys the argument for the resurrection or for miracles, they will commonly complain that the atheist has a naturalistic bias, but on close inspection, what they're really complaining about is that the atheist does not have a supernaturalistic bias. So, while most arguments for God may not assume that God exists at the outset, they usually end up there once you start working backwards through the supporting assumptions. And we'll leave it at that for now. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Be sure to hit the bell to be notified when a new video comes out. And if there's something you'd like to ask this atheist, leave a comment below. Thanks so much for joining me, and we'll see you in the next video. I'm David John Wellman, and the rest is up to you.